All right, everyone, let's wrap up our discussion of emotion and talk about how it is possible for us to both cognitively and physically experience emotion. We're going to be looking a lot at brain structures, hormones, the biological implication of experiencing emotion. So, this is going to rely a lot on the neuroanatomy pieces that we learned about in Unit 3. So, how are emotions experienced? You have two key ways. One is unconsciously, and the other is more consciously. Each one of these routes ends up actually using different portions of the brain. For unconscious levels of emotion, this is a much more fast response kind of system that enables us to operate more automatically and relies on a lot of deeper brain circuitry that has been kind of implanted as we've gone along and grown in various different experiences. This is meant to be an early defense kind of system that produces emotions like fear or anger to help us get out of dangerous situations that could cause a problem for our survival. So these do have a very evolutionary piece to them. The conscious route is a little different because this relies on your cerebral cortex, that higher level decision and thought processing piece of your brain. This is going to generate emotions at a much slower rate, but it delivers more complete information to our consciousness. So whereas unconscious emotional expression has a tendency to be very knee-jerk, and a lot of times it can happen before we think things through, and any one of us have been in scenarios where our emotions have kind of gotten to the best of us before we've thought the situation through. But conscious routes of emotional expression have a tendency to, even though they're slower, give us the complete information we need to have a more appropriate emotional response to things. So the biological structures that are involved in all of this, the first one to keep in mind is the limbic system. So we've got our hippocampus, our hypothalamus, and our amygdala. And we're going to be looking at this in terms of the more unconscious route of emotional expression. The amygdala, if you can remember all the way back to Unit 3, deals with the kind of more instinctual drive of emotions, fear, anger, aggression. So the amygdala is constantly on alert for threats, and so this is why it is more heavily used in that more unconscious route, because it's meant to provide us with those very fast, quick kinds of emotional experiences to help us get us out of danger. You also have the reticular formation that's involved. This is going to work in conjunction with your thalamus and your amygdala to monitor your incoming information. So if a threat's detected, it can then set in response motions that will arouse your body, get your autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic subset of that, into action, so that way if there is a threat, you can find your way out of it. Cerebral cortex, we've already talked about this. This is going to interpret events and then associate them with memories or prior feelings that you've had through experiences all up in your life up until that point. It's really important to remember that each half of the cerebral cortex is going to involve itself in different emotional expressions. So this is the second time that we've emphasized this with emotional theory. So you very much want to remind yourself to star it and emphasize it heavily in your studying for this unit and for the AP exam. Your right cerebral hemisphere is going to specialize in the experience of negative emotions. And your left cerebral hemisphere is going to specialize in the experience of positive emotions. So when you feel happy or extreme senses of joy, that's going to be dealt with from your left hemisphere. And when you're particularly sad or upset, that is going to be in your right hemisphere. You have your autonomic nervous system. We've made references to this. The sympathetic nervous system is going to become active once you are startled or when you experience any kind of unpleasant emotion like anger or fear. Parasympathetic is going to be involved more so in dominating the experience of pleasant emotions because you're in that kind of calmer, resting state. So you're not on heightened levels of alertness and awareness and fear all around you. It's also important to know that your hormones play a role in how it is that you experience emotions too, and the kinds of emotions that you feel. Serotonin is involved in feelings of depression. We've discussed its link to the development of depression in people. Epinephrine is involved in producing fear. Remember, that's a hormone that works in conjunction with the adrenal glands and the sympathetic nervous system to help kick you in that fight or flight response. Norepinephrine is another hormone, but that is involved in your experience of anger. So it's important to make sure you don't get those two confused, epinephrine and norepinephrine, because they do sound so similar to one another. So how do we experience specific kinds of emotions? There's an overall agreement that for the most part, there are 10 basic emotions that human beings experience. We have joy, interest or excitement, surprise, sadness, anger, disgust, contempt, fear, shame, and guilt. Now, think back to what we discussed with the expression of emotion and Paul Ekman's research on how it is that we can be able to recognize certain emotions and facial expressions. Many of those are already found here in these 10 basic emotions, so this should be relatively easy for you to remember as you move through studying the emotion piece. So let's look at fear and the overall experience of that. Fear is oftentimes ended up learned through a conditioning piece, through classical conditioning or even operant conditioning in terms of punishment, and observation. Okay, so the conditioning piece to this is that you're associating emotions with a specific situation or item. That situation or item was previously neutral up until that point. It was paired with something that evoked that natural reaction of the fear from you, and so you've developed a conditioned response of fear to that situation or item. Observation is when you watch what happens to others, whether it's that they display a fear towards something or a situation has happened to them and you learn vicariously through that. We've heard that term before, vicarious reinforcement or punishment. And so you watch what happens to them, see what follows, and then you end up learning your actions in kind. So if you watch others display fear towards snakes or spiders in certain events, you may yourself end up operating on those in a similar situation. We're biologically predisposed to learn fear because fear responses in some situations help us to survive. So as was previously said with that whole comment on evolutionary psychology and how some of this stuff has been predisposed in us to help us survive, this is very much one of those pieces. The amygdala plays that key role in associating our emotions with specific situations. So interestingly enough, if it's damaged in some way, emotion isn't associated with a situation, so a fear response ends up being diminished as a result. So if you had at one point learned a fear of spiders and your amygdala is damaged in some kind of car accident or something along those lines, you won't necessarily develop or have that fear again to the level that you did prior to the accident because the amygdala is not able to create that emotion and associate it with the situation that we found ourselves in. Now, anger is a little different because there are many, many, many different factors that can fall in line with causing us to get angry. Anything from something that someone else does to us to even just aches and pains. I found myself in particular when I had my knee surgery, it was very, very easy for me to become kind of quick to anger because of the aches and pains that I was going through. My temper was just very, very short because I was just so sidetracked by the pain and my frustration with my knee that it just was very easy for me to experience that anger. So then the key piece to this is anger good or bad? In some situations, can it benefit us? In some situations, is it really not necessary? Chronic hostility, interestingly enough, is linked to physical damage to your heart. It can link itself to heart disease because you have that tendency to kind of cause the body to just be in this heightened state of alert, and that's just not good for it to be in physically. But controlled expression of anger can be a good thing. It's much better for you to do that, to just kind of express it when something affects you and bothers you initially, rather than just allowing it to build up and build up and build up and build up, because that can lead a person to end up just kind of stewing over things and leading itself to a much bigger kind of emotional reaction and problem than if they just talked over what ended up offending them in the first place rather than just sitting and stewing over it. One theory or hypothesis on anger and, how it should be released or addressed and expressed is the catharsis hypothesis. This is when we attempt to release aggressive energy to relieve the aggressive urges that we feel. So catharsis is a means of just kind of purging things out of you. If you've ever heard of somebody saying that sometimes a really good cry is cathartic, that's what they're referencing there, that it just feels good to get all of that out of them and out of their system. Research shows that expressing anger can be temporarily calming, but it usually doesn't end up clearing up the feelings of rage that are behind the issue. So it's important that you be very careful in how much rage is expressed and how often. Because if you're just constantly hostile toward other people, that can end up lending itself toward cruelty, just people not having a very positive response to you, not wanting to be around you very much. And that oftentimes can be because of a level of operant conditioning. It's a means of reinforcement that we experience, because once we express that anger and we get it off of our chest, so to speak, we feel better. And so that's a means of reinforcement. We will continue to do that activity if it removes that aversive experience of just feeling kind of pent up and angry and hostile. So the best way to deal with anger is to wait until your physical arousal calms down. So when your physical state is in a much more steady and calm manner, that's when you should go about expressing it, because a lot of times the physiological arousal can lend itself to expressing much stronger levels of emotions than you intend, or even saying things that you didn't really want to say in the first place, that end up coming out much more harsh as a result. So lastly, let's talk about happiness. People who are happy perceive the world to be safer, they make decisions much more easily, they're more cooperative, and they just generally live much more satisfied lives. One thing to kind of couple with this experience of happiness is a phenomenon out there called the feel good, do good phenomenon. This is something that is discussed in the watching of How the Grinch Stole Christmas. People tend to be helpful to others when they're in a good mood. I mean, think about it. When you've had a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day and somebody asks you to help them out, you're really not all that inclined to do it. But if you are in a very happy state of mind and you feel really good that day, you're much more likely to help them out and kind of pass that favor along. Daily events generally only cause moods to be altered in that day where happiness or even anger is concerned. So even significantly bad negative events seldom end up destroying a person's happiness permanently. And I can very much attest to that with the experience of losing my dad. That is something that truly does affect me on a daily basis and causes me to experience a wide range of different emotions. But it has not stopped me from being able to be generally happy in my everyday life with the other things that are going on for me permanently. It's also important to recognize that we have a tendency to operate on the adaptation level phenomenon within this issue of experiencing happiness. We tend to judge various stimuli as relative to those that we've previously gone through. So we adjust certain levels of our emotions, and then notice and react to variations of those things up and down. So, for example, let's take a look at this and try to see it in an application form. If you won the lottery tomorrow, according to this principle, you'd have this massive surge of happiness initially, like it would just be the most amazing thing ever. But then you'd end up adapting to the new lifestyle and you come to consider it as your new normal, so to speak. And so as a result, then you require something even more strong to kind of get that surge of happiness from you, because it's something that we've just adapted to and adjusted to, and we perceive it as something that is kind of neutral at that point. So that's the adaptation level phenomenon. So the last thing to talk about, what has been linked to happiness and life satisfaction, some things that we can take away from this lecture in our real life. First and foremost is high self-esteem. If you regard yourself in a positive manner and you don't allow demands of other people or society to influence how you see yourself, you're much more likely to be happy. If you have an optimistic attitude, if you're someone who sees things as glass half full rather than glass half empty, you're much more likely to be satisfied with your life. And the same thing goes for having close friendships and a satisfying relationship with those, whether you be married or just with a boyfriend or girlfriend, or even just relationships with family. Work and leisure that end up engaging your skills. If there's something that evokes some of that intrinsic motivation that we've talked about, where your work and leisure activities are concerned, you're far more likely to be happy. They've also found religious faith, meaningful religious faith, so taking stock in that rather than simply just going through the motions of going to church because it's expected, that has a tendency to increase people's happiness. And lots of sleep and exercise also have a tendency to help. Since exercise tends to release quite a bit of endorphins, which are linked to pleasure sensations, it makes sense that those would end up helping you to feel a level of happiness the more often and frequently that you do exercise. So, that is the end of our discussion on emotion. You'll be moving on to stress, which is our last topic for the unit. So, if you have any questions, just let me know.